sake of the world, burn like a fire in me. Light a flame in my soul for every eye to see. For the sake of the world, burn like a fire in me.
Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. If you're leading a small group on the week of February the 1st, 2015 for Dayspring, then this video is designed to help you get ready to facilitate this week's small group session. Now, if you've got your Going Deeper guide with you, the one dated February 1 through 7, go ahead and get that. And we're going to look at it together. That's the guide that you're going to use to lead your small group time. And I'm going to look at it with you. We're going to talk about it together, and hopefully that'll get you ready to lead your small group time. Now, as we get ready to look at that, before we look at it together, let me go ahead and give you the big picture of what you're really trying to do this week, because this discussion time may be a little different than usual, because the sermon is going to be a little different than usual. What we're going to be talking about this week is obviously a continuation of life on mission and what that looks like. Now, here's where we've been so far. As we've been talking about life on mission, we know that God himself is on a mission, has been since the beginning of time, and that mission involves the reconciliation of fallen humanity back to himself. So the Father sent the Son to accomplish the work of making a sacrifice for the sin of humanity. Obviously, Jesus did that. And then Jesus has commissioned us now to go and make disciples of all the nations. And he has told us that wherever we're going is where our mission field is. So that's where we've been so far. As we looked at the Great Commission together, we saw that Jesus basically, he wasn't necessarily commanding us to go. He was commanding us to make disciples. And the going is just a description of who we are. We're people on the go. And he said, wherever you go, whenever that is, however you get there, just realize that wherever you are, you're a missionary in that place and in that time. So that's where we've been so far, the fact that we're going. Now, this week, what we're focusing on is the going, and how there really does need to be some intentionality to that, that it's not just a matter of me saying, well, you know, I go where I go, and wherever I go, I'll make disciples there. I mean, that is part of it. But when we really, really begin to live life on mission, this is what we're talking about Sunday. When we're really starting to think about every man and every woman and every child having access to the gospel, the mission compels us to start asking the question, where is the gospel not? Where are the places where the gospel is not yet? And because we start to become more and more committed and obsessed with this mission of every man, woman, and child, eventually we'll start asking ourselves, should I go there? And how can I go there? So this Sunday, what we're hearing are a couple of testimonials of people who have decided to go somewhere specific. You know, one of those is far away, all the way up to New Jersey. One of them's just right here in town. So we're not talking about signing up to be a church planter or a missionary in that regard necessarily, although some do that. But we are even saying, even in our own city, where are the places where it's just total darkness and maybe I should go there for the sake of the mission. So you're going to hear some testimonies of that this week. And I hope that you and your group will start off by really talking about what you heard and what struck you. And I think a win for this small group session for you as a facilitator, a win would be that your group starts thinking about where you could go. Where can you go to start taking the gospel to places where in our city it's not yet? Now, there may be some from our church who end up going way off, like Megan has done right now from our church, who's in London. We have others who've gone to train for seminary and some who are off pastoring in other places, those sort of things. Hopefully there will be some people who are sent off to those sorts of locations. But in our city, where do we need to go? Where do we need to mobilize ourselves and take the gospel for the sake of the mission? I think a win from this small group discussion for you would be if your group starts to identify or even just start talking together. Where should I go? And more specifically, where can we go? Because where you're going to bring all of this in your small group discussion is the intentional going in the context of partnership. All right, so that's what you want to talk about. Look at your small group discussion guide. Let's talk about the details now. Number one is just your recap section. What did you hear Sunday? Talk about that together. There's really just one point, one thing that's really going to be put on the screen for you. You may talk about that point. You may talk about the testimonials. And I hope that you guys spend a great deal of time talking about the point and the testimonials, okay? But that's where you're going to start. Now look at discussion point number 2. This is where it's going to start talking about the partnership angle of us intentionally going where the gospel needs to be found. Francis Chan, he's a popular pastor and writer these days, a Christian writer. He says, while every individual needs to obey Jesus' call to follow, we cannot follow Jesus as individuals. The proper context for every disciple maker is the church. It's impossible to make disciples aside from the church of Jesus Christ. So Chan's talking about the need for togetherness, and really he's making a very valid point. Our very call is to make disciples and to be made disciples of. You cannot do that as an individual. The very process of disciple making necessitates other people and togetherness. So you're going to talk about that. There are a couple of follow-up questions there as you start talking about the togetherness nature of disciple making and missional living. All right. Now, discussion point number 3 leads you to a Bible text, John chapter 17, verses 20 through 23. This is a prayer that Jesus prays right before his crucifixion. Jesus prays for those who would follow him. So I've always thought this is one of the coolest verses in all of the Bible, because when we read this, we are literally reading Jesus praying for us. I mean, this is Jesus praying for me and my small group. This is me praying. This is me reading Jesus praying for me and Dayspring. This is Jesus praying for us. So I've always thought it's one of the coolest passages of the Bible. And you're going to read that together. Now look at what it says. It says, shortly before Jesus would ultimately give his life on the cross, he prayed a few final prayers for those who would follow him, both at his time and now, for all time, who would follow him. What was the theme and purposed result of his prayer? And you'll look at verse 21 to find that answer. What was the theme of his prayer and the purposed result of his prayer? And the purpose result was that we would be one, but it's not just that we would be unified for the sake of unity. It's unity for the sake of the advancement of the gospel. So Jesus actually took the time, and think about this. This shows how important it is. Before Jesus is about to be carried off to the cross, he takes time to pray that his church would function as one body so that the world would see the gospel on display. And you've got some follow-up questions there in discussion point number 3 about congregations working together. And how can this happen? And I'll tell you, if you just want to talk about how this can happen and how this ought to happen, it's my deep conviction that if every man, woman, and child in Mobile is going to have access to the gospel, then the congregations in our city are going to have to start working together as one body. That's a deep conviction of mine. And in recent days, just so you'll know, I began meeting with pastors and facilitating and spearheading monthly meetings of area pastors from every stripe and color denominationally and regionally and all of those things within our city. We're starting to talk together about every man, woman, and child, using this language together. And very soon we're about to start strategizing and taking ownership for our city to see to it that we actually try and carry out the mission of every man, woman, and child. That's something that you and your group can be praying about as I try and lead these efforts for ministry leaders in our church. But how can we partner with other congregations? What might that even look like? Just start daydreaming about that with your group here on discussion point number 3. Discussion point number 4, it talks about the challenges of church planting. You have a chance there to talk about the New Jersey missionaries that will be interviewing at church. So that should make sense to you. Look at discussion point number 5. At this point, you're going to move on to Acts chapter 2. This is the birth of the church. And you're going to see what they did and what was a priority for them. But look at your discussion guide. It says, read Acts 2, verses 42 through 47. So you and your group will read that together first. Then you'll start looking at the remainder of this discussion guide. It says, as the church began, there was such a devotion to a single mission that many people were being exposed to the gospel and coming to faith despite all of the existing boundaries. And then it says, though there are clear benefits for partnering with others to carry out God's mission, many congregations never work together. What do you see as the roadblocks to that? And how can these roadblocks be overcome? So again, this whole discussion guide is about the necessity of us doing the mission together. It is impossible for us to take the mission to every man, woman, and child and to do that as lone rangers, both individually and as an individual congregation. So togetherness is necessary. And again, as the group facilitator, why don't you do this? Because in the sermon, you're going to hear people saying, we recognized a place where it was total darkness. We recognized a place where the gospel was not, and we decided to make that the place that we go. That's the place that we are now going, and we're trying to put the gospel on display there. You as a group, maybe you can get this rolling. Maybe y'all can start to daydream and say, where are the pockets of people in our city where gospel representation is desperately needed? And then you start brainstorming together. Can we do this together? Dream up an idea. Dream up a ministry initiative. This doesn't have to be something that starts off in the bulletin. Maybe your group can be the next group that's doing the kind of things that we hear testified about on the stage this past Sunday of a group of ladies who are now ministering to ladies who don't go to church. Maybe your group will be the next one to have a great idea. And as you do that, as you and your group maybe rally together and say, hey, here's a ministry endeavor, and maybe you get that off the ground and you start representing the gospel in a place because you're deciding to go to that place, think about this. That's how every man and every woman and every child eventually find exposure to the gospel. So that's what this discussion guide is all about this week. And again, I think this is one that if you spent just as much time talking and strategizing and daydreaming and coming up with plans, if you did that as much as actually reading the Bible passage and studying this week, I think that would be a win. All right? There's a great close to your discussion guide on discussion point number 6. It's your weekly memory verse. And let's look at it together. Look at your handout. Paul says to the Philippian Christians, he says, in all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel. Partnership, it's a beautiful word. Let's partner together, y'all. Let's work together and think together and go together so that every man, woman, and child can have repeated opportunities to hear and see the gospel without ever having to go anywhere. All right? God bless you. Thanks for listening in. Have a great small group time together. I can't wait to see you Sunday.
Confess